top story today is the bushfire emergency unfolding across the state.
Climate change isn't the cause of these bushfires.
An agenda of climate change denial, reinforced by the Murdoch media. There's no direct link between this drought and climate change.
There is such a thing as just plain weather.
Australia is where Rupert Murdoch's media empire was born. His news outlets there have got climate change denial down to a science. Australia, soaring temperatures, extended droughts and persistent winds have resulted in a wildfire season like no other. Yet, as so much of the country burns, most of the Australian media, outlets owned by Rupert Murdoch, refuse to call this story what scientists say it really is, a disaster exacerbated by the climate crisis. Millions of acres have been burned out, dozens of people have died, wildlife is on the run. And papers like The Australian and networks like Sky News Australia are not just dismissing the scientific consensus, they're trafficking in some false, debunked narratives instead. Rupert Murdoch's media empire has long held a disproportionate influence over politics in Australia. He and Prime Minister Scott Morrison are united on this issue. Throw in Murdoch's close ties to Australia's powerful fossil fuel lobby, and all of the elements are there for a conspiracy of disinformation on the biggest, gravest story of our time. Our starting point this week is Sydney. Taking in the coverage in Rupert Murdoch's Australian media outlets of the historic, devastating wildfires and the climate change angle can be confusing. That is by design.
Does climate change cause these fires? No.
Gone are the days of hardcore denial of climate change, disputing that the planet is overheating. What the Murdoch media now specialize in is climate skepticism, denial, taken down a notch or two.
I agree that the climate is changing. It's been changing for billions of years.
Arguments that pin the cause of the wildfires on anything but global warming.
Lightning strikes and arson are overwhelmingly the triggers for bushfires in this country.
Sound bites that bewilder rather than clarify.
Now, there are a lot of things that go into making a bad bushfire. Global warming is not the big factor there.
That undermine the prospect of a consensus and ultimately advocate that the best thing to do about climate change is nothing at all.
Because they didn't want to admit that it was climate change which made these fires so uniquely awful, they've been emphasising side issues. So one side issue has been arson. For example, someone had a barbecue that got out of control or something, they were calling this arson, saying, oh look, this is villainy and human nature and it's got nothing to do with government policy, but in fact that's been a false emphasis.
We had some crazy theories about how it was all to do with clearing land for high-speed rail and that they wanted to burn this much land so that we could get cheap property for the trains. It was kind of insane to watch it unfold when you had authority figure after authority figure, scientist after scientist, firefighter after firefighter saying, we have never seen fires of this intensity before. This is not business as usual. But we saw those theories really take hold, some of which was published in the Murdoch papers.
Australia has one of the world's most concentrated newspaper markets. 60% of the papers sold are published by Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, including the only national daily, The Australian. The company also owns a 24-hour news channel, Sky News Australia, the biggest cable company, Foxtel, and other TV channels. On the climate change story and the wildfires, the various newsrooms feed off of and feed into one another, making News Corp Australia a multi-platform corporate ecosystem of its own.
The way it works is that you get very prominent, skeptical commentators, people like Andrew Bolt, who's a well-known, prominent climate skeptic.
You see, there is such a thing as just plain weather.
And he has his own program on Sky News called The Bolt Report, and he also has a regular column in at least 2 other Murdoch-owned outlets. So it sort of has a multiplier effect.
The global warming hysteria right now is insane.
It is not necessarily the journalists or the journalism. It is, though, a lot of what is happening in their commentary space. It is what is happening on Sky News, where they interview climate denialists.
I'm optimistic enough that one day someone might find that humans have an influence on climate, but I'm yet to see it.
Where they have entire programs dedicated to dismantling the science based on either misrepresenting what has been said, a misinterpretation, or somebody who is not qualified to speak in that area being held up as an expert.
And not just cross-pollination between each other. Newspapers setting the tone for radio talkback shows. There's also a huge number of former Murdoch staff who go in and work with the Liberal Party and the National Party as things like policy advisors and media advisors. And that flow happens in reverse as well.
You have to accept that the nation's most preeminent experts say there's no direct link between this drought and climate change.
The revolving door coughs up someone like Chris Kenny, who openly campaigns for Liberal Party candidates while he's the associate editor of The Australian.
No, there's nothing Australia has done or could have done that would have altered our climate in the here and now, and there's nothing that Australia can or ever will do that will change the global climate.
There's no delicacy about this. There's no Chinese wall or anything even pretending that this is not an improper relationship.
On the criticism that the company is getting over its coverage of the wildfires, News Corp told the Listening Post that contrary to what some critics have argued, News Corp does not deny climate change or the gravity of its threat. However, we do report a variety of views and opinions on this issue that are important in the public discourse on the fires.
A lot of the News Corp publications have come out swinging against allegations that they have not taken climate change seriously. The Australian came out with an editorial which attacked other media outlets for their coverage of the News Corp coverage of the fire crisis. I don't think we're going to see any change, though, in the News Corp editorial position. We're not going to see any sort of, come to Jesus moment from some of their biggest stars or mea culpas, because their editorial shows that they don't believe they have anything to apologise for.
Rupert Murdoch inherited his first two papers from his father in the 1950s, then bought more Australian publications before expanding in the 60s and 70s into the UK and the US. Over the years, Australian prime ministers have learned not to cross him. The current PM, Scott Morrison, has the Murdoch media's seal of approval. He's a conservative. His initial emergency response to the wildfires was to sneak off to a vacation in Hawaii. The previous Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, was toppled in 2018 and replaced by Morrison, in large part over Turnbull's plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That policy alienated many in his own party, as well as News Corp, and the other central player in this story, the Australian mining sector, to which Rupert Murdoch is also closely linked.
It's very difficult to pinpoint accurately the influence over individual media empires over political outcomes. But there is a sort of coincidence of interests between the Murdoch empire and the current government of Scott Morrison. But I think it's more likely that what drives the government is their closeness to the mining sector. If they have to admit to the link with climate change over these fires, then they obviously logically have to take far-reaching action in cutting emissions, and that would mean cutting their extractive industries on which the economy is very dependent.
The Murdoch press has always been very pro-mining. When Murdoch was a young businessman in the 1960s and 70s, Australia's agricultural exports were declining, partly because of Britain joining the EU, and he and many others saw the national saviour as being mining. So he's always had himself personally very strong pro-mining views, and that's been reflected in his papers.
The Murdoch factor in climate coverage is not limited to Australia. There's a larger problem. Study after study has shown that climate change skepticism is far more prevalent in Anglosphere countries. The exceptions are places like Canada and New Zealand, English-speaking countries where News Corp is not a major player. Skepticism is noticeably higher in the US, Australia, and the UK, which happen to be Rupert Murdoch's biggest markets. There's a clear pattern there that is undeniable.
That's like a John Lennon question. Imagine there's no Murdoch. Well, we don't have to imagine. We can look at New Zealand. They just passed very aggressive emissions targets with bipartisan support. We can look at Canada. We can look at other kind of comparable countries in the Anglosphere which don't have Murdoch media. In Australia at the moment, with Murdoch's influence, that is unthinkable.